When we selected you, I was under the impression you all had full-time jobs, but clearly that's not the case. But I do appreciate all the hard work that you've put into this. Your knowledge and expertise are invaluable to this effort to bridge the gap between data, finance, and law, which efforts have become increasingly important as the Commission rushes to define and implement mandates under the Dodd-Frank Act. Today, each of the four subcommittee working groups will present their interim findings on universal product and legal identifiers, standardization of machine-readable legal contracts, semantics, and data storage and retrieval. The standard-setting process is relevant to the rulemaking process as the Commission develops new mandates and requirements for the reporting and disclosure of massive amounts of new market data. Failure by both the regulators and the market participants to use common metrics increase the risk and misapplication and misunderstanding of critical market information. I'm aware that several of our proposed and even final rules present inconsistent approaches in the manner and form in which the Commission is seeking information about the entities and transactions. There are multiple data collection rules that must be coordinated to ensure the Commission collects what it needs on a timely basis to perform its oversight and does so in a manner that is well-defined and cost-efficient for the market. The several rules that I'm concerned about are the large trader rule, which was recently delayed to compliance challenges, the proposed joint SEC, CFTC, and separate CFTC rules requiring reporting by commodity pool operators, commodity trading advisor under Part 4, the soon-to-be finalized swap data record-keeping rule, and the soon-to-be proposed account ownership and control rule. First and foremost, the Commission must require that all filings be submitted electronically and in a mode and manner that is specified by the Commission and is consistent and cost-effective for the market. Second, the data requested be on mandated forms and to the greatest extent possible ought to conform to the form and standards currently utilized by entities to minimize compliance costs and confusion among market participants. Finally, federal agencies must do a better job to quantify the cost of the reporting burdens and the additional cost of requiring different data streams across various rules and across different agencies as well. I will work to ensure that each of our rulemaking teams carefully consider the demands they make and to ensure that their requests will be useful, cost-effective, and coordinated. Without a doubt, data is the foundation of a solid oversight and surveillance program. It is also the lifeblood of markets. I recognize that the four working groups here today have worked long hours to provide recommendations that will ensure our data streams will provide a strong foundation that will be long-lasting and useful. I'm grateful for your assistance and the time that you have allocated to developing these standards. We have a narrow window between now and the end of the rulemaking process to develop cost-effective and useful data standards to describe the complex financial interaction. I intend to leverage the work of the subcommittees or the working groups to ensure that our rules apply these data-conforming recommendations. In closing, I'd like to thank our Chief Economist, Andrei Kirilenko, Nancy Doyle, Andy Tatai, and John Mark Buffa for their leadership with the subcommittees, as well as our colleagues from Treasury, FERC, and the SEC who have also participated. With regard, I have my housekeeping matters. This meeting is open and being recorded. It is also being webcast. And then obviously keep your phones away from the microphones. We have an order in which we're going to take the presentations. And let me turn it over to Andre for any remarks from him.
Thank you, Commissioner Malia. Thank you to all of you for coming here on Friday afternoon for our second open public meeting of the Data Standardization Subcommittee of the Technology Advisory Committee. You all see in the agenda in front of you, we're going to have two presentations followed by a break, then another two presentations. These presentations will summarize the work that the working groups have done between the last public meeting and this public meeting, and also sort of inform all of us across working groups about where we're going with these efforts. Sort of logistically, we set up a laptop at the end of the table, so the presenter or presenters would like to come there, sit down, have their presentation uploaded, and proceed so the public could see it. You, as an individual presenters, are welcome to, within the time allotted to you, which is 30 minutes, are welcome to set up the format if you wish to take questions during the presentation. you're welcome to do that. If you wish to take questions following the presentation, just specify that. If you wish to take no questions, then just run through your 30 minutes, and there'll be no time for questions. So the format is fairly open to how you'd like to run it. We have, as Commissioner Malley said, this meeting is being recorded. There are people listening in on the phone. There will also be, this meeting will be available on YouTube, but the video presentation will be available on YouTube. So without further ado, we can start with, and of course, we would like to thank, especially thank to those, as Nancy just reminded you, who just came back from Basel, to be here. This is great, and would also inform the discussion that we have here. So we could start with the presentation of Working Group 1.
Okay, so I'll kick off. First of all, just thank the Commission for an opportunity to give an update on UPI and LEI. I thought first, as an introduction, we looked at UPI and LEI, and first thing we wanted to do was create what our purpose was, because we knew that both in LEI and UPI there already were industry groups in form. A tremendous amount of work was underway, and we didn't see, from our perspective, our job to define the UPI or the LEI, but to ensure that the industry was headed in the right direction. So we spent some time in terms of evaluating what the working groups were doing and the direction they were going in. The thing that we thought as a group more than anything was to understand the standards and be able to start explaining what the interdependencies are between the standards and sequencing of rollout. So for example, what would be the impact of UPI on real-time reporting, and what would be the impact of LEI on end-of-day reporting, and starting to lay out what some of those interdependencies are and how the Commission may take our recommendation in terms of sequencing and timeliness. And so part of our mission was around advising on implementation. We also found it to be very helpful to have Andy from the CFTC and Walter from the SEC in our meetings, and also advising us on the types of questions that the rulemakers we're grasping with around standardization and what impact it may have on reporting was one of the areas we spent quite a bit of time on. So as an intro, I think we just wanted to lay out what our purpose was and where our focus was, not only on the standard itself, but the implementation schedule might come forth on the back of that. I'm going to turn it over to Malene, who's going to walk us through the LEI portion of the presentation.
So our first recommendation is that we feel that the Commission should strongly support the recommendation as set forth by the trade associations, which is a group of several market associations, for the existing LEI initiative that's already underway. So this is a new ISO standard. It's ISO 17442. It's currently going through the ISO process to become a final standard, and that process is underway across the next few months. SWIFT is the registration authority that's been selected, and DTCC, through their AVOX subsidiary, is the facilities manager. And they are both doing this in conjunction with the Association of National Numbering Agencies, through the national numbering agencies as potential authorized third-party providers. So this initiative is well underway, and we're not aware of any other competing initiatives in the LEI space, so we would strongly recommend that the Commission support this initiative as it exists. The rest of our recommendations are really going to be around implementation, and we've sketched out what we've discussed across the last several weeks, and this is the sort of the form that the recommendations will take. So a tactical plan needs to be put together so the industry can prepare for the required regulatory reporting. And we've had discussions with DTCC, AVOX. I work for SWIFT, so with SWIFT as well. on how maybe some of this tactical work could be done. And there's a recognition that we need to deliver 50,000 LEI records, cleansed and validated, by June. So some pressure to get ready for June. So there are plans underway to accomplish that, to put together a tactical plan. We also thought about, and this is a recommendation we intend to make, since we feel fully behind the LEI initiative as it stands, we thought, well, why not start to assign some of these LEIs now to some of the more perhaps systemically important financial institutions, the institutions that have to start the swaps reporting early, have those temporary reporting IDs look and feel and taste a lot like the existing LEIs. So assign those sort of on a temporary basis to allow for some early testing. So what we had discussed is that maybe by October, understanding that October is actually tomorrow, but perhaps maybe by the end of October, perhaps take these important entities and assign them LEIs. Now, again, officially they won't be LEIs because the LEI is not an official approved standard yet, but it is in draft, and we know the form of it, so assign them according to that form. For, say, 2,000, we sort of picked 2,000 because we understand there are approximately 2,000 swap reporting important counterparties, but maybe it can be even less than that. Try to get that done, let's say, in the next 30 to 60 days, and then assign, again, these temporary reporting IDs, although by June, the LEI should be an official approved final standard. So by June, we can assign them to 50,000 entities, and 50,000 has been sort of knocked about as the number of swap reporting entities that would actually have to start reporting by June. So assign those 50,000. And again, follow the same principles as the LEI standard, the draft standard today: unique, no intelligence, persistent, scalable, etc. So follow the LEI standard and really start things moving more swiftly. And we have had a lot of discussions about testing and implementation time. So we feel pretty strongly that testing needs to begin at least 6 months prior to any actual required regulatory reporting. If we can start it before that, that's even better, but at least 6 months prior. And we recommend sort of two different phases. There a build or a beta phase where there's a small number, and the next slide, actually the last slide, goes into some of this, but I won't go into all of this. This is sort of a draft that we were working on about the proposed timeline. But the idea, again, would be, let's get some temporary reporting IDs assigned now, assign up to 50,000 by June, and then full implementation by the beginning of January 2013. And the test plan sort of lays out what some of those details would be. So this is sort of the gist of what our recommendations are going to look like. We'll probably have summary information on slides, but we'll actually put this information in sort of a white paper of some sort. And we were assuming that this would be the deliverable that we would provide at the next meeting in November. So I guess we're happy to take a few questions if anyone has questions.
Can I just make one comment?
Absolutely.
I think the discussion around the temporary LEIs was, we were kind of fixated on, if you want to do end-of-day reporting, let's say sometime in Q2, end of Q2, it'd really be helpful to have LEIs in place, even temporary LEIs, right? There was a debate that we had within the group about, well, the DTCC, and Bob's here, you could talk about this, has IDs, obviously, from the prior clearing work they've done. They have a lot of IDs. But if we could have, for the SIFIs, the ones that are we think the CFTC would be most concerned about, if we could get those IDs distributed as immediate as possible, get all that information out to all the various people who are working on end-of-day reporting, and get into a test mode so that end-of-day reporting could happen in earnest by the end of second quarter, that's why we were so fixated on the temporary IDs more than anything.
Could I ask just one brief question? The 2000, the LEI registry, the database allows for, in fact, requires a parent entity, a sort of a hierarchy, and an ultimate parent. So when you say 2,000 entities, are you talking about 2,000 top-level entities with more beneath? Are you talking about 2,000 in total, sort of leaf elements, or are these all just root entities?
I think we've used the number 2,000. In reality, I think what we think in the group is actually a smaller number. It's probably, if I were to guess, 100 to 200 at most, that you would consider to be the SIFIs, as you guys, I think, refer to them, the most significant at risk. And those are the ones we would focus on first. When we met with the LEI folks, one of the things they told us is there's a lot of data scrubbing. There's a lot involved in getting the data right. And that's why it's going to take such a long time. So our group themselves said, well, okay, we understand that. What about if we reduce the amount we have to do? Start with 50, do the next 50, get to 100, get to 200, and work your way up. So I think we're trying to find that parent, that entity that you look at and say, those are the ones that are risky. Get those done first. Would even take input from the regulators on what those are, right? Cleanse those data, get them out to all the people working on day-to-day reporting, and then start the cycle again. And that's why that slide, it talks about build, beta, reiterate. If the slide we put up, it's cause that cycle to continue to happen, and then you work your way up.
Walter raises a good question. So if you go from 50 to 100 to 1,000, do you do it vertically within the organization, or is it the breadth of the industry? Do you, so let's take Barclays, for example. Do you start with an LEI for Barclays, and then you start dealing with affiliates and subsidiaries? Or do you attempt to do Barclays and as many other potential competitors, if you will, trading partners? Which is more important in deploying this LEI?
I think it's probably from a risk point of view, but I would assume whether you're thinking of Barclays or let's use AIG as an example, right? You'd want to have all of the sub-parents of that so you can see the complete exposure. So I think it's about getting depth around the complete entities. That would be our view. The other point probably is as the various dealers, whatever, are passing this data down to you guys, what we'd probably do is have them build it in such a way that all the data came down, but the roll-ups were only for the top 20, 40, 100, 200. So we were getting the systematic risky kind of parts out first.
I'd like to introduce to you our newly appointed Chief Information Officer, John Rogers, and he might have some questions about, since that will probably affect our systems, whatever rollout you do in temporary IDs.
Thank you. Actually, one of the questions I had directly relates to what you were just describing, and I was thinking about the process of assigning these IDs and what kinds of thoughts you've had related to the relationship of the parent-child relationship and the reporting of that information, so that we could actually crosswalk from, as Commissioner Amalia mentioned, Barclays up and down the chain.
Yeah. When we have the discussion specifically about the temporary IDs, it's really about assigning an LEI to the swap counterparty. So who is the party that's engaging in the swap? When you assign an LEI under the current model that the initiative has, ultimate parent is a field that is considered core. So who's the entity that has the exposure, the entity that traded the swap, the purchaser or the seller, and their ultimate parent? In the model that DTCC and ABOX have, they actually already have IDs assigned to many of these counterparties already. So ultimate parent is the field that would be part of the core. Now, there will also be lots of other fields about other subsidiaries, interim parent. That kind of hierarchy is obviously quite important. But the core of the LEI would be the entity itself and its parent. Additional attributes in the LEI database would be those other attributes about intermediate parents, other related subsidiaries. But that would not necessarily be part of the public database of LEI that we're talking about in this model.
So then, if I understood correctly, you would be able to do, you'd know the counterparty for the transaction, and you'd know the ultimate parent, but there would be some other method then of knowing who the interims would be in between there.
Yeah, so in the DTCC Swift AVOX model, the core LEI public database has to be based on data that's available publicly. So lots of subsidiary, related subsidiary, intermediate subsidiary in many jurisdictions is not public. So the core database will have what's publicly available, and there will be service providers, possibly including DTCC and Swift, that would add on top of that other hierarchy, relationships, et cetera. But the core LEI will be assigned to the trading counterparty, and the ultimate parent would be identified.
Mainly just a quick question. Are we looking at doing the 2,000 and 50,000 as a testing process, or to get a jump on expected deadlines? Because there are two different dynamics at work depending upon which way you're headed.
I think the idea was to try to do a little bit of both there. So get a jump on what's needed. More importantly, test and iterate across the next few months on how it's actually going to be implemented. So getting a jump on it is certainly a good idea. The more important part is the testing part.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. The testing part is really important, and the financial institutions need a lot of time. It would be ideal. So I did come back from that Basel meeting, and there is a close alignment with the rest of the world on the recommendation, but not quite. And if the CFTC could somehow be aligned with the ESMA and the EC on their evaluation process, which I think is happening in an expedited manner, you deal with the perception problem, and the financial institutions do need that testing time frame to look at the structure and make sure it's going to work in all their systems.
Mike, do you want to elaborate on that, the conformity issue, the difference in the two regulatory approaches?
Scott, I'm not sure there's a difference. I think it's really just a process that they go through for evaluation of a standard and adoption and alignment amongst all of the EU and rest of world participants. There are still a few open issues on the standard, one of which would be, is it just the business card, or do you include ultimate parent with some kind of hierarchical data? So that's an open issue, plus assignment and commercial structure and some other things. But generally, the rest of the world was in agreement on the standard. Their time frames are a little bit immovable, and they feel the pressure that the U.S. has to act. So if there was some way to align that a little bit, they feel some pressure, maybe we could give them a little more time, and I think you're close.
Could I comment on that? I think the reason that the focus was on getting the financially significant counterparties as quickly as possible is that there's a view that the CFTC reporting deadlines are looming, and so therefore creating something interim and then using the LEIs as a final state solution, if there could be a way of having the final state solution, even if it's for a smaller set of entities first, provided the opportunity to do that, whether that was at the end of the day what could be done, because the testing is very important, obviously. So it was without some interim LEIs, the requirement or the perceived requirement dates for CFTC reporting couldn't be met at all with LEIs. With them, it might be. So it was a case on that. But the other side of it is that if the reporting requirements could align with the time frame that is actually going to be become a standard, then that's a different thing entirely, because then it would be a case of the industry, all aspects of the industry, getting around, let's use LEIs, let's use the real standard, implement that once and not have interim implementations.
And the good news, Bob, is I don't think there is any question by anybody that they will all use the standard. It just really comes down to time frame and rule writing and perception.
I notice on here that there is a final rule, CFTC rule finalization. That's news to the rest of us, which is great. I mean, we'll take it in November. Okay. So if the rule finalization, then we have a phasing, we take so many months to phase it in, and we start with the most sophisticated people. Is there a fallback is there a technology solution in case we have to kind of work a system that's a little different than what we can get to under this plan? Just assuming that in 6 months, 50,000 people have LEIs, but assuming that stays the same and we have reporting before then, what would be required to fill in the gaps?
So I'll answer from one SDR perspective. DTCC has been across a number of RFP processes selected to be a swap data repository for the 5 asset classes under consideration by the SEC and the CFTC's rules. And our take is that in lieu of an LEI, that we have to come up with a mechanism of identifying entities. DTCC has, through our derivatives products, a pretty good percentage of the firms that transact derivatives, but certainly by no means all, who are using our services today. That's one alternative. Some asset classes are looking at doing that. In other cases, there is really less use of DTCC's IDs, and FX, I think, is an example of that. More use of BIC codes. BIC codes are the SWIFT BIC, they're ISO BIC codes. Those have some issues from a long-term perspective from an LEI. They don't map one-to-one to LEIs. There's some minor concerns along that. But that's an alternative as well. We're working through that on an asset class by asset class basis from an SDR perspective. I think, though, that those are all interim solutions, without doubt, that cost some money to implement. And then the bottom line is that, as was stated, I think there's no doubt that using LEIs in the long term is the right thing. It's just good for a lot of reasons. So that'll happen over the time frame, but depending on the implementation dates, the mandatory implementation dates, it either allows LEIs to be used, or because the implementation date of the rules is earlier, then an interim has to be used, and then a conversion cost out of that to the final LEI solution.
Yes. So, Marlene, one question, maybe a suggestion is, are you talking to confirmation services about this, for example, market? Because one issue that you have at BlackRock is, like, we have a swap across 10 accounts, okay? And we execute with Barclays. So the execution party is Barclays. So we submit a trade for confirmation at the block level. So we are confirming then that trade against the execution party, Barclays. But then out of those 10 accounts, maybe 5 of them will be facing Barclays US, 5 of them will be facing Barclays London, another different legal entity. Now in the confirmation service right now, there is no space for that. So basically we send that swap and say this was done against Barclays. So there is no space for at account level say, no, the execution part is Barclays, but the legal entity that each of these accounts will be facing is this and that.
Well, one of the things that we looked at, the reason we focused on end-of-day reporting is we, as a group, felt strongly that without LEI, the effectiveness of end-of-day reporting would be minimalized, right? We didn't look as much on the confirmation side because we didn't feel as a group that it was as important. And that's really the distinction between the two approaches. Because when we thought about end-of-day reporting and its purpose is trying to give entity exposure. I mean, without an LEI, it's really it minimizes the impact of that report. I think to Bob's point, though, I think there are other short-term ways we could get something implemented. My gut is that in the end, that will just take us longer, actually, to get to the final stage by these other interim steps. And that was one of the kind of debates we had within the group when we actually had a 2-hour workshop, and we invited the DTCC in, SIFMA, and other people in to talk to us about the LEI implementation. And I think at one point in the meeting, we got to this point that said, if we don't get these IDs distributed soon, then it was sort of a 6 to 9 months after we get them. So if you look at the 50,000, which looks like June, you'd actually have to add some time to that before the end of the day would be in place. So I think there's some definite gives and takes here in the approach. Our recommendation at the moment would be to go with the 2,000 or less and get the end of day going, get to all the reporting parties who have all different kind of party IDs internally to hook up to these, get all the technological bits going, get the testing in place, learn from it. You know, it's great to have Walter and Andy in there so we can talk about what the problems we're having, right? And then start that iterative process, right? Because there will be issues as we go through this. Hopefully I answered your question as well.
So just for your question specifically, our focus for our recommendations is around just the reporting, but eventually the LEI is going to cover just those entities that you mentioned, but initially it'll be focused on what's needed for regulatory reporting. But eventually it would get there.
I was just listening to that. It might be helpful in your recommendations if you could, it might be helpful to the public to specify as you're sort of phasing that in to show how the architecture as it's been sort of developed would serve different purposes, that it will start out with reporting and then different purposes would be served. So people, you know, still buy the idea even though they may have, but they'll say, look, it will deliver, just not right away.
I think the white paper will have a little bit more background about how it's actually going to work. We didn't want to use the time here for that, but it would definitely have some of that in the final paper, definitely.
There was a second half of what we were looking at as well, and that's the universal product identifier. And on that, we had a fairly extensive discussions. I would say a big chunk of our meetings have been on the universal product identifier. There was I was going to say a summary of why you need it, but actually the very recent FRB analysis of CDS transactions, the implications for public reporting actually says it is better than probably we would have. It said, lastly, this is in their conclusions, lastly, we believe that price reporting is beneficial if the prices are interpretable and meaningful, which requires coordinated and comprehensive collection of trade data and consistent standards for price reporting, and especially where there are different disseminators who share the duty of price reporting. It's really the comprehensive collection of trade data and the consistent standards bit that we were looking at from the UPI perspective. Again, as Neil said, we're supportive of, and we understand that there are industry initiatives going on to look at product identifiers for coming up with standardized product identifiers for the derivatives market. And our goal was not to be a separate initiative. It was really to take a look at that and talk from a recommendation perspective of how that would work and how that plays out from an implementation perspective as well. So basically what has been the state of play right now is that there is an ISDA-led initiative underway. Oh, thank you. Duh. Yeah, technology is not my strong point. There's an industry-led initiative to put together the UPI structure, and what it has followed is a process of taking a look at taxonomy, so the various types of products, and there'll be a recommendation probably in terms of the taxonomy, adopting the taxonomy in the final rules for identification of the types of swaps. There's an effort underway for taxonomy. There's an effort underway for then within each product type, what are the different elements of a trade that make up a unique product? And then an effort in terms of generation of those UPIs and usage of those UPIs. That industry effort is underway. The timelines for implementation, though, vary by the asset class. And it also, within the asset class, it varies as well. There's, by their very nature, some derivatives are very complex and bespoke. Those complex and bespoke trades will have a much more difficult UPI generation, and longer UPI generation, if ever, than the more standardized products. We've took a look at that, and it's really sort of it's not an 80-20 bit, it's more like a 90-10 or 95-10 of more standardized products where a UPI could be easily generated based on the work of taxonomy and the work of determining the trade elements, and then a tail of more exotic or more complex, more bespoke products that have a hard time, if ever, of generating a UPI. The work that's going on per asset class is that the taxonomy work is finishing up. So what type of products, what broad classification of products is largely completed and will complete over the next month. What is now happening are two initiatives, really. One of which is the UPI specifications themselves. What data elements comprise each product class or each taxonomy classification? What are the elements that would need to be represented, and where they're different, they represent a unique UPI? The other bit that's going on is really more of a technological approach of how do you generate the UPI, what is the mechanism for both the identifier itself and more of a human-readable a way of representing it. Once those two pieces are done, then there needs to be some time to take it up. And the take-up process is important on this. This is like this is very important from the structural bit of the industry going forward. It's kind of like making sure your 12 millimeter bolt fits your 12 millimeter nut. You know, the standard's got to be right, and then furthermore, there's got to be take-up of the standard in order to have effective, we think, real-time public reporting. So it's going to take a while to do that. It's going to take longer for the more complex asset classes. The asset classes that are more standardized or have evolved to more standardization, that standardized bit will go faster. The second slide is really, it's a bit complex, but it shows the general thought process of how to get to the UPI itself. So in summary, we've got standardized trade representations. It's typically done through FPML representations. FPML is a XML way of representing a trade. The idea is to have a standardized way based on the product taxonomy to then strip out the important portions of the trade, create both a UPI, basically the binary UPI, or a machine-readable identifier, create a human-readable version of that as well, more viewed as a ticker. The UPI itself, the raw key, will be absolutely unique. The ticker itself may have some cases where it's not unique, and there's still some discussion on that. And then furthermore, having a full product description of what the basically using XML again, a full product description of what the UPI is. This represents work that is ongoing. This is not a final state here. This is, there's a technology working group within ISDA that's looking at the UPI generation. But this, we thought it would be useful to give a view of how that's going. From the last bit, and I think Neil's going to walk through this, but there's one thing that I think that's core in our thinking here is that we were looking at UPI from the real-time public dissemination perspective. And again, back to the FRB report that just came out on credit. Until there is a way of representing products in a way that can be intelligible and known and unambiguous, we have a strong consensus in our group that not having that would frustrate public reporting and perhaps be counter to the actual policy goals of public reporting, because it could be confusing as to what the price meant, confusing as to what the representation of the trade was, confusing in terms of depth of liquidity. So until there's I'd say, I want to just, before talking about the timing of this, I wanted to point out that at least within our group, there's very strong consensus that the UPI is a necessary component. It's going to take a little while to finish off because it's brand new for the industry. It's going to take a while to finish off, and the more complicated the asset class, the longer it'll take. So, Neil?
On slide 4, so what we try to do is to come to the Commission and actually lay out some timelines around the implementation of UPIs as it relates to real-time reporting to SDRs and then for PET reporting as well. And so our first recommendation is that we should stagger the implementations instead of trying to do all 5 asset classes at the same time, and that we should focus on credit and rates first. And that timing kind of looks like the definition of the UPI spec and implementation, taking into the end of the year into January, going through a build period that would take us into end of second quarter, and going through a comprehensive test period that by the end of October we could have UPI-based reporting both through the SDR and through the public dissemination live for rates and credit. Obviously, it's the same concept as with the LEI. There's a beta, build, test, iterative, learn, and then refine as we go through it, and then come back and work on the FX, equities, and commodities asset classes, leading towards a late 12, early 13 implementation. Now, it's not the case that the FX and equities and commodities folks would just be waiting till we start there. There'll be further definition and refinement that goes on through that period. Now, I realize that timing may be a bit longer than what the Commission was hoping or expecting. And we did have a debate about, is there any decoupling that could go on? And in theory, there is, that we could get real-time transactions being sent down from CEFs or dealers, depending where that is in the implementation, to the SDR based on the taxonomy of the product. But we would not recommend to going to public dissemination of real-time reporting without a UPI. It would be really hard to look at a tape and be able to figure out what that product was. But if we wanted to split the implementation in terms of real-time reporting to an SDR versus when the public dissemination of pricing and transactions, where I think that would be possible as well. Also, I'd say that we spent a lot of time thinking about what is realistic and what isn't. And part of this is, and Andy actually pushes pretty hard to say what you think it would take to do this. You guys have a lot of experience in implementation. You kind of do this for a living, and not to come with a different answer in terms of what you thought it would take. I think that's it on the formal part of the UPI presentation.
Yeah, Neil or someone else in the group, just a question. If you generate the UPI from FPML, there's often multiple ways of representing identical economics in FPML, but to get to the same result in terms of a trade. So for example, I could have a cross-currency swap and an FX forward that really have the exact same cash flows, but they would be represented differently. Is there an intent that the UPI always be the same if the economics are the same? Or is it only always going to be the same if the FPML is the same?
We have focused on the reporting aspects of a UPI, right? Not using the UPI to price or generate cash flows, right, as part of the solution. So based on the architecture that's kind of in the page in front, we think that if you use a standard trade representation with a set of asset class defined rules and apply it through an algorithm, you will almost 99.9% get a standard UPI. But we are using this mainly for reporting and not as a pricing or cash flow generator, because I think there's a lot more involved if you want to take it that far. But it would be a standard product representation. So I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, maybe I'd add one little bit to that, is that from a purely technical perspective, within an asset class, you're absolutely right. Do I pay fixed? I can say I pay fixed and you pay float, or I could say you pay float first and then I pay. I mean, there's places that are exactly the same. The first bit, and I didn't spend too much time on it, but the very first bit of this UPI generation is getting down to the standard representation of the trade before you bring it into the algorithm that generates the UPI. There's been a fair amount of thought that's gone on in that. I think that's different than I get to the exact same cash flow across more than one asset class. Each asset class would have its own way of generating that unique set of unique and same order, because that's important in order to get the same UPI consistently. Each asset class would have its own way of doing that. The idea here is that it would be a public algorithm that anybody who has the data can generate the UPI. So that's one aspect of this that's being considered as well. So, but the point you raise is important. We have to solve that. It's a technical bit, but it's an important technical bit in order to get a uniform UPI. That's one of the reasons why it's going to take a while to get to the UPI definition. It's not like it's tomorrow it happens. There's some important technical considerations to take place.
I think it's just a little bit more than just some minor technical things. I was going to pick up on Adam's statement. Did you give any thought at all about instead of unraveling the XML schema, just define it by its contractual attributes, and then you can roll that up into an ISDA category, but there are links to the classification scheme. There are links to our ability to define the underlying contract structure that need to be solved before you can give an instrument a number. So,
yeah, again, as I pointed out, there's an ISDA working. There's basically a series of ISDA working groups, not like a single one. But what has happened now that the taxonomies have largely been, and it took a while actually to agree that here are broad classifications of trades that can be modeled with similar types of attributes. That took a while to get right. The next step is this a group that's looking at it from a technical perspective of, all right, once we have the list of attributes, how do we actually produce a UPI, the type of thing that we were just talking about here. But then there's per asset class working groups that are going on that are dealing with the more semantic issue that you're talking about of which attributes really should this product type have in order to generate a unique UPI.
So just necessitates that we have agreement on that underlying classification scheme up front. That's a prerequisite, if I hear you correctly.
Yeah, that was a basic idea, and it was led largely by the fact that there's classifications. There's large scale classifications in the current CFTC rules, and And the idea was that while what's been suggested from the taxonomy committees is a more detailed version of that, that's the right approach to go because it allows, it also supports the policy goal of being able to aggregate across taxonomy.
So thank you very much for this presentation and discussions. We, of course, could continue during the break and exchange some views on this if people have additional thoughts and comments. So now we move to Group 3. Group 2, I'm sorry, machine-readable.
Yes. So it would be good if you can, if you have the presentation in front of you, we'll be basically following the presentation. So I'd like to, present, a status report, what the group has done so far. I'm going to go through, what the group is, what our, deliverables are, and then, Pierre and Michael, they're going to go into more details of what we have done so far. So working group 2 is machine-readable legal documents. Just to refresh, part of the group, we have Pierre Lamy from Goldman Sachs, Paulo Rodella, me from BlackRock, Michael Will from DocGenix, and also Nancy Doyle from CFTC, Walter Hampshire from SEC, and Bill Nichols from OFR. So we have been meeting at least once a week, but more than that as well, and that's how we put this together. So the next page, so there's a refresh, what the proposed deliverables are for this group. Recommendations on how and when standardized machine-readable legal documents can be created for more complex swaps, including ISDA master agreements and collateral documents. Recommendations on how much machine-readable data can be standardized for regulatory oversight or delivery to swap data repositories. Recommendations on whether, how, and when data on lifecycle events can be captured and analyzed by regulators to analyze net exposures in the markets, to do, what-if scenarios. Any recommendation on how to standardize bespoke products for machine readability. And finally, comments on or recommendation on how to implement Section 719B study recommendation concerning machine-readable documents. I think as part of our latest meeting, one thing that was very clear here that we want to point out as well is that what we mean, at least what the working group intention is, what we mean by machine-readable documents is not just scanning the documents you have now, create a PDF and save in the computer. So machine-readable documents, break it out in attributes in data that you can create programs to analyze, the data to run what-if scenarios. So we thought it would be important to make that point here. We couldn't put it here because that was the last thing we discussed before. This was already ready for a print. Finally, before I pass it to Pierre, our approach, the way we see this is we see, the legal agreement part of it, the portfolio level, and then the transaction level documents. For the portfolio level, requirements analysis, our first approach is a certain regulatory intentions, what is the intention, what we want to do with the data. Determine scope of legal documents, what legal documents it is in scope, and legal clauses that we are interested on. Then the representation. Evaluate the potential of proposed ISDA standard credit support annex to be the first machine-readable portfolio level agreement. So we have had meetings with ISDA, and Pierre will go through that. Also, a big concern of ours is legacy document. Determine a pragmatic and progressive path to normalize it, represent as data the most critical legal terms from a regulatory perspective. As part of a cost-benefit analysis, conduct an industry-wide survey to evaluate the feasibility of such approach and its potential benefits. So again, our concern is always costs for people, companies to implement this. The idea is go talk to them and also, explain the cost and benefits as well. That I believe, at least from a BlackRock perspective, there is a lot of benefit as well for our companies. On the other side, the legal agreement, the transactional level data. So we have a two-piece here, the standardized products and the most complex one. For the standardized products, we would like to confirm understanding and expectations as they relate to the life cycle events and their exposure analysis implications. evaluate the state of the industry as it relates to electronic representation of legal clauses in the cases where portfolio agreements do not apply or are overwritten. And finally, the complex, the bespoke products. So this is where we all know here that's where the problem really lies. Evaluate the possible avenues for an industry-wide algorithm representation of these products. Every time a bank creates a new product, how can we make sure that we can still represent that product in a way that the computer can understand? So now, Pierre, Michael, you're going to go over the next pages.
I'm going to look now at the portfolio level legal agreements in terms of the requirements analysis and go into a little bit further detail. We've met with representatives from various agencies, the CFTC, the SEC, FERC, and the OFR, and we were attempting to do two things: identify the relevant legal agreements and the relevant legal clauses contained within these agreements. We received a message loud and clear. Systemic scenario analysis is a priority. What the regulatory authorities are looking for is legal agreement data which will enable them to identify and monitor systemic risk factors. You're looking for conditional legal clauses embedded within these legal agreements that will facilitate the what-if scenarios. My father was in the Army. He always used to play war games. And I think that's a pretty useful capability to have. You can always model what's likely to happen next. Now, the other thing that also came across loud and clear was that you're looking for interconnections between parties, the domino effect. What's going to happen if somebody fails, where the result's going to fall. We asked specific questions in connection with pricing, and we ascertained that that's not the primary focus, at least in the medium term, as participants will be required to report their own current valuation results at the portfolio level. And they will be, of course, taking into account their relevant collateral terms as part of that process. So in terms of the scope of the legal agreements we're looking at master agreements, related credit support agreements, master confirmation agreements, and also as well confirmation agreements. There is also a further category of documents which relate to all of these, which are amendment agreements. These agreements, particularly the master agreements and credit support agreements, are perpetual. They're put in place at the outset of the relationship, and they're never meant to expire. So you really need to be able to monitor what's happening as these agreements progress over time. From the point of view of the types of clauses embedded within these agreements, you're really looking at trigger events with the potential to adversely impact a contracting party. And then there's two categories of related party, namely credit support providers and specified entities. Now, turning to the next page, there is currently an ISDA initiative called the Standard CSA Initiative. Currently, this is a proposal. The ISDA board has yet to give it the green light, but nonetheless, we think it's something that you should be made aware of. The scope of the standard CSA is limited to non-cleared new trades, but existing existing trades can move from an existing CSA to the SCSA, but not vice versa. The document itself, the standard CSA, is a standardized and structured version of the widely used ISDA CSA. And it will provide a number of important benefits to participants in the market who take advantage of it. First is to align the collateralization mechanics and economics of the bilateral and cleared OTC markets, to provide more consistent pricing, a reduction in risk, as well as a reduction in the costs associated with hedging. It will also simplify the processes associated with collateralization and reduce margin disputes resulting from pricing differences amongst participants. Finally, it'll facilitate the integration of collateral terms into the pricing calculation by eliminating complex bespoke legal clauses. We've discussed with members of the ISDA CSA working group the possibility of a machine-readable version of the document from the outset, and this has been very well received. They've indicated a strong desire to tie in with a number of regulatory initiatives, including machine readability, as well as the legal entity identifier. The next step in this process, and I don't want to prejudge it, is approval by on October the 11th of the ISDA board, and we will report back at our next meeting what they actually approve. So that deals with the ISDA standard CSA, which relates to new trades. We, of course, still have an overwhelming number of legacy CSAs which govern or will govern the legacy trades. And perhaps I can just illustrate the problem here. Pierre, we're on the next slide. Despite the existence of industry standard documentation, such as those published by ISDA, the prevailing bilateral negotiation process, which is driven primarily by lawyers, has resulted in an infinite variety of legal clauses that are difficult but not impossible to represent electronically. Now let's just take a look at a various subset of legal clauses that might appear in a CSA, for example. You might have eligible collateral and thresholds. Each of these provisions are frequently subject to ratings criteria. Now, imagine you have a single concept, a ratings downgrade trigger of BBB+, a simple concept. And you can see that on the right-hand side of the table there. But on the left-hand side of the table, you will see a small subset of the ways that lawyers might express this particular concept. And the problem really becomes very apparent if you look at the first two examples on the left-hand side, because neither of them makes mention of the letter B or the sign plus. The subtlety in the language is downgraded below A- or ceases to be rated at least A-, means the actual trigger itself, even though it's not expressly stated in the contract, is BBB+. So that's just one of the issues that people will need to confront in terms of these legacy documents. How do we propose to approach this issue? Well, we propose to define and refine a progressive path to electronically represent legal clauses of this type contained in legal agreements, focusing specifically on the data that is of most value to regulators. A pragmatic and realistic approach, which also takes into consideration a thorough cost-benefit analysis for market participants, will be the keys to success. The initial scope will need to be defined and limited. The concepts in these legal clauses are multidimensional and involve many data points. Returning again to a ratings downgrade trigger, you'll have to think, who is rated? What is rated? Is it an entity rating or is it an instrument rating? If there are more than 2 rating triggers, do they all have to be satisfied, or will a single breach trigger an event? So our next steps will be to identify and prioritize a range of legal clauses of interest to regulators. We'll be focusing on the parties, specifically the contracting party, credit support providers, and specified entities. And we'll also be focusing on the events that can occur to these parties, events of default, additional termination events, specifically where they're rating or net asset value dependencies. In the collateral area, we'll be focusing on thresholds and eligible collateral, again subject to rating and net asset value dependencies. We're actually going to get some help from ISDA here because they've agreed to participate with us in an industry survey to validate the data scope, priority, utility, and cost benefit.
Thank you, Mike. So we talked a little about the portfolio level agreements. Now we will talk about what is the approach that we propose to have in relation to trade and life cycle events. And first about standardized products. We looked at standardized products in relation to 2 different topics. The first one is this question of life cycle events and relationship with net exposure. And the second one is the legal clauses. So in relation to the first topic, the question that we're being asked to look at is how can the way we will present life cycle event could affect the way regulators would look at net exposure. The view that we have on the working group is exposure is essentially associated with the current state of the contract at a point in time, rather than life cycle event that relates to those contracts. So in that respect, the working group recommendation is that the Commission's approach of suggesting that depending on the asset classes, we could have a daily snapshot approach or lifecycle event model will not adversely impact the ability for regulators to analyze net exposure. In relation to trade level legal clauses, so what we have on the marketplace is Mike talked a lot about the master agreement at the portfolio level, but you could have either parties will not have a master agreement, or you could have trade level clauses that will overwrite the master agreements. So as we look at the machine readability representation of those legal clauses, we also need to take a look at what is being done at the trade level across the different asset classes for which you have different practices and for which the way those clauses are being used can be quite different. As we look into that, we think that we also need to look at what is the type of counterparty that is involved in those transactions, because as we know, this is a topic of standardized products, and depending on the type of counterparty, swap dealer, major swap participants, or end users, a part of that business will move into clearing. So what we definitely want to do as we develop recommendations in relation to those type of trade level legal clauses, we definitely want to focus on those that will remain in the bilateral world as opposed to move into clearing, because that would not be a good use of time and effort. Second topic is complex and bespoke products. So the working group shares the conclusion of the algorithmic study, stating that the current standards have limitations as it relates to more complex and bespoke OTC derivatives product representation. In terms of proposed approach, what we suggest is as an initial step, evaluate suitability of what is being called the generic product data representation for those complex and bespoke OTC derivatives. This leverages a concept developed by FPML to support portfolio reporting, for which portfolio reporting there is a need for parties to represent the full population of trades. And you have also a number of participants in the marketplace that for their own internal representation make use of this generic product representation for the most complex products. It also corresponds very closely to what DTC has been developed with the industry as being the copper record representation for the complex credit default swaps as part of the trade information warehouse. If this approach would be perceived as unsuitable by regulators, then we would engage into evaluating other protocols for presenting such complex and bespoke derivatives. The reason we do not want to pursue this avenue in the first place is because our assessment is that will be most costly for the industry, because the industry would have to develop for a given asset class two sets of protocols, a protocol for the standardized products and a different one for the most complex products. So what we would prefer to do is definitely to pursue the first approach, which is let's see with the standards, with the set of standards that is being used by the industry, which is namely FPML, if we can make use of the generic product representation. And the next step on that is to develop a working note that will detail this generic product representation and will describe how it could be used for the purpose of SDR reporting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I have two questions. I noticed that there's a couple mentions of cost-benefit analysis, and that is something that I'm very interested in. And to all the working groups, I'd be interested in having a better understanding of what the costs and the benefits of each of these proposals will be, and over time. So as you begin to dig deeper into these issues, please keep that in mind, and if you can support our analysis going forward, that would be helpful to feed some of that data into us. And I would think that possibly in Working Group 2, the costs of compliance would be higher than something in Working Group 1. Do you have a sense of what that might be? Or I noticed you're going to do an industry survey, and I'm kind of keen as to learn when that might be done.
Well, I think it's we're going to consult with ISDA in terms of getting this thing out as quick as possible. In terms of the actual cost, obviously it's very difficult to say right now, but one of the things I would like to highlight right at the outset is that the industry is much further advanced in terms of their access to trade-level data than these portfolio legal agreements. And that's something you as regulators must bear in mind. They have a long way to go to catch up. I mean, it's admirable that they, certainly the reception that we've had is people really appreciate now the importance of this data. I'm sure everybody's looking through their CSAs recently, looking for U.S. Treasuries rated AAA requirements. So it's something that's fresh in people's minds. And they will appreciate that they will have expended both internal resources and potentially external legal resources going through these documents. So we'll try and ascertain how much they, what the benefit to them is as well as the cost.
Yeah, just to add to that, we're very, very keen to develop a pragmatic and practical set of recommendations. Because I think what we need to do is, as we develop a path, especially as it relates to legacy documents, we need to be developing a recommendation that will be usable. And anything that we'll do, we need to take into consideration the fact that the cost, but also what we want also to try to ascertain is benefit not only for regulators but also for market participants, because we feel that this is a place where potentially there could be really practical reasons for thinking that we could be in a better place if we have a practical step moving forward on both sides of the equation.
This is medicine, but it is good medicine. You may classify this as medicine, but it is good medicine.
I get that frequently from our rule teams. Can you elaborate on this client segmentation analysis?
Yes, the topic is when we look at trade level, at legal clauses that are the trade level, what is obvious is as a result of the Dodd-Frank ruling, a large part of the business will go to clearing. So when you have bilateral clauses that exist on the marketplace today between two players, when those trades will go into clearing with new trades, then those clauses will not be in play anymore. What will remain in play is essentially, in fact, the business that we have with end users. So what we want to do as we look into those clauses is what the usage in terms of type of counterparties. Because our initial perceptions, it might not be even across counterparties. And it could be, depending on the asset classes, that those, for example, optional early termination clauses are mostly used among dealers. If they would be, for example, and this is really only an assumption, but mostly used among dealers, then let's not focus on capturing them moving forward because the business will move into clearing. So this is where we need to be pragmatic and thoughtful about developing recommendations that will be of practical use.
Mike, I understand your objective. I think it's a great objective, but I'm not clear at all on the approach that is being advocated, because I know that you want to electronically represent the master agreement and the credit agreements and the like, but are we semantically representing them? Because, it seems to me that we're talking about creating a semantic model of the contract, which defines meaning of the contract, commitments associated with the contract, and when you do that, you can then slice, dice, and reconnect this contract because you've already defined meaning. Or is there a different approach that you're advocating?
I don't think we've made a particular decision in terms of how best to achieve this objective. I mean, looking at it from my background, I'm most familiar with, and I think the industry is most familiar with, technologies such as XML to represent the concepts contained in these particular legal agreements. The difficulty that I think that we have with legacy agreements is that we're kind of stuck with them. We need some way to represent them. I don't think there's the appetite amongst the industry or indeed the capability to go out and renegotiate in a different format each and every master agreement and credit support agreement that they have. So I think we're looking at more of a markup approach perhaps than a semantic approach, if that answers your question.
Could But most of the paper talked about the legal agreements like the CSA. There is a small fraction of trades that are still done, on paper. Are basically the trade attributes are they're not standardized trades. They're complex, exotic trades. Yet those are to be reported, and don't seem to have any exclusion from the types of reporting that is necessary for and therefore much easier if it's electronically represented. Have you given some thought on that, and maybe you can talk to that a little bit?
So the representation of complex and bespoke products?
And further from the perspective of meeting the SDR reporting requirements.
So the things that we will pursue as the next step is this approach of evaluating the opportunity to leverage the generic data representation that we have in FPML, which is, as a very high-level background, is normalized data representation that focused on a set of key fields. So that will be the different dates of the thread, the notional, the underlier. And so, in fact, what you end up with is a data representation that gives you a very good level of information in relation to what is the counterparty of the thread, how it fits into the taxonomy, what is the notional of the thread, what is the type of underlier, when the start and end date of the risk, and then in relation to valuation, the same level than the other asset classes. What it doesn't describe is the economics of the thread. But if the SDR and the regulators, which we understand are not in the mode of wanting to reprice the threads at this point in time, we perceive that this is well sufficient for the industry altogether. And this is, I think you're familiar, Bob, at DTCC with the copper representation. That's exactly what it's the approach. And that would be, we perceive as being something which is practical, feasible, and that could be a good way to get the full population of exposure informations in the warehouse in a meaningful time frame.
I'll just point out that I'm good to hear that's because our groups had not talked ahead of this particular meeting, and that's consistent actually with the way that the UPI thought process is going as well. So that's a consistency bit.
Yes, we're also working closely on the UPI topic.
If I can also just raise one other issue. As a former lawyer, when I look at these agreements and try and represent them as data, one of the things that really comes across loud and clear is that there is just a lot of ambiguity in the way that these documents have been drafted. They're frequently put in place in a real hurry because the trade's ready to get done. And that's one of the things that we have been struggling with, how best to represent those particular concepts, ambiguities. It's a challenge.
So I'm clear, I think this next step with this generic product data representation will be to bring together the variables in the document with what potentially will be reported to the SDR, correct?
Well, in fact, you have different main follow-ups. One is the standard CSA, which we believe is really a good avenue, standardizing, and this is a good use case of a strategic direction in which natively, as you define the standard, you have a native electronic representation. That's approach number one. Approach number two is, can we do something practical in relation to the legacy document? So that's engaging with the industry to assess what the state of the situation, what can be practically done. So that's master agreements. On the thread level is do the same level of analysis in relation to threads. Where do we have, let's say, optional early termination clauses for which type of counterparty to see should we do something? And then on complex threads is to propose this generic data representation and engage discussion with regulators as to could this do the job? And then with industry is what would it take to do that across the board? So 4 different set of actions.
Great, thank you.
So Michael, going back to what you said I wasn't quite sure how to quite decipher your message, but would that be a hope to eventually have sort of machine-readable representation as a native representation?
Sounds good to me. I mean, ideally, certainly my aspirations, and I'm speaking personally, would be for these documents to be created, negotiated, and stored without ever having left the electronic form. I mean, interesting enough, there's a little bit of a history of XML, is that it was actually designed initially at the outset to apply to legal agreements.
Is that something that you think FPML as it currently stands could support, or would you need to develop something?
FPML is primarily focused on the trade level, the transaction level, data representations. There will need to be an awful lot of work done at the master agreement, portfolio level agreement, to come up with an equivalent standard, if that is the direction that ISDA would like to take it.
Yeah, I think to add, when we think FPML, there is two levels of FPML. There is FPML as what the standard is, which is very much a trade representation, but then there is the FPML as an organization, which is a different question. Is if we come back with the standard, what's the right way, what's the right place to host that standard and evolve the standard that to be seen.
I think I really like the way you presented the what you plan to do with bespoke instruments, and that it seemed to me like you were presenting sort of a baseline as go in with the FPML, and then alternatives as go in with sort of other standards. And so it would be useful to see, as you reach out to the industry, what do you think the cost might be of doing that?
Exactly, and as part of that, we will also propose a framework, because when we think about standard versus non-standard, the question is what the watershed between those two, and how does the product evolve from one place to the other place. And I think we'll also look at, for example, what has been done as the TCC, because this is what we have with TIW and the credit from moving from copper to gold. There is a process that exists, and I think these are things that we can leverage.
If I could just add on to that, I'm sitting in a lot of industry meetings. I would say that an awful lot of the time the discussion is on a very small tail, this complex product representation, and the need to report it, the need to meet the rules for what is a very small tail of the product set. And with the thought process, or at least the consensus view is that, well, if it's in the rules, we have to do that. So therefore, whatever time compliance is for the standardized products or the more electronically represented products, the ones that are more easily, reported and such, that that if the exotic ones, and if we use the word exotic, have to have the same time frame, then we've got an awful lot of work that has to be done in order to do this very small tail that doesn't represent too much of the market at all, and arguably not that much of the risk, although arguably. I think that in some respects that the mass of the trading volume, which is on standardized products and going toward clearing, getting that right in the short term is a lot easier than this long tail, which I think has document issues and all the other types of stuff that's being talked about. And that might be a consideration for the Commission as well.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take a break now. I'll give you your whole 15 minutes and then come back in 15 minutes so you have a chance to chat with each other and informally. Well, welcome back to the next two presentations.
All right, so I guess I wanted to comment up front on something that Michael, that you said at the end of your session. XML is just a wrapper. We still need to define the things that are in that wrapper correctly according to their structure in our contract, and how components relate to one another and things of that nature. And that's what I believe we're talking about when we talk about semantics. I will also preface this to say there's a lot going on in this semantic conversation. We're still trying to gain alignment completely amongst all the participants in our working group. So I'm going to present the areas that we do have consensus on and raise for you some of the questions that we have in our own mind. As you listen to all of these presentations so far, we see that there is a semantic link to product identification, a semantic link to classification, a semantic link to modeling contracts and commitments and terms. And it's a very hot topic around the industry amongst firms, regulators globally. Of all the things that I've been dealing with, this one's probably the hottest conversation in the industry. We also notice that there's lots of confusion in using this word semantic. And in fact, semantics, ironic, semantics suffers from its own semantic deficiency because there are differences between data definitions, business ontologies, XML schemas, messaging protocols, and we even use a word to talk about a processing technology called semantic processing, and they all get jumbled together and there's a lot of confusion. So we're going to try to sort some of that out a little bit in the context of what we're doing. We are looking at the end of this activity to assess business ontologies legitimately against their use for OTC derivatives. We're going to say about, is it practical? Can we implement some of these things? And where do you draw the line of what can and can't be implemented? And then we're going to look at some of the options that exist because we realize that regulators are facing deadlines and the industry has a conversion challenge ahead of it. So let me talk about our operating assumptions up front. I think we all agree on these assumptions. The first assumption is that the contract drives everything. These are all legal agreements. They're all based in the contract. You got to understand the components of that contract at a structural level. We also agree that business definitions about financial instruments and legal entities that are embedded in that contract are mandatory, and we need a consistent set of those definitions if we're going to be able to compare things, apples to apples, lots of firms around the industry. We also agree that confirmation processes associated with XML schemas, FPML in specific, are critical. You got to have a handshake. You got to have a confirmation message. You got to have a timestamp. All of those things are now embedded into the infrastructure that exists, are absolutely essential to maintain because that's part of that analytical process. Everything that we recommend has to be looked at and measured against operational reality. So there's some new directions that are happening in industry. Some of them are very new, and it's hard to implement very new when the industry's not ready. So you got to look at what is real and what is not real. And OTC just has the fortune of being the first of the big regulatory activities that will be implemented. So everything is going to be based on what happens within this CFTC and IOSCO framework because we're talking about transparency objectives, systemic analysis objective, market surveillance objectives, clearing and settlement objectives throughout the entire industry and all financial domains. So the first thing that we did was to look at a whole bunch of use cases, and we have a use case document that I have circulated to our group. I'd be happy to make available. It's not a consensus opinion document, so we're not presenting it here, but we do agree on the use case areas. So the first use case is what we call appropriate identification. It's unambiguous identification of the underlying contract, including all the schedules and agreements, using standard terminology and uniform meetings across any messaging protocol, whether it's FPML or FIX or whatever. The second use case is about firms' compliance with requirements. We have to be assured that they are providing complete data and data that can be analyzed appropriately for lots of different applications. We need to be able to classify 6 ways to Sunday. We need to classify based on sectors, based on cash flow, based on structures of the contract, based on exposure types, underlyings. Any scenario you can think of, you might want to classify according to those criteria, and that's one of the benefits of semantics. We also need a lot of analysis, and that analysis is going to be according to multiple scenarios. So open positions and collateral and volume and limits and whether maturity dates and other characteristics, reference attributes, lots and lots of things that you're going to want to analyze depending upon what ray you're cutting through that evaluation. From a systemic oversight perspective, the real objective here is to link. Right? So we need to identify things, classify things, and describe things, but ultimately these all need to be linked so that you can run multiple scenarios and understand relationships, dependencies, and hierarchies. And of course, you can't do that kind of analysis at a very granular level. You need to be able to aggregate consistently so that you can do that kind of analysis, roll up, and look at various trade repositories reporting and various companies around the world. So when you look at the categories of use cases for semantics, I think they become almost overwhelming. Let's then take a step back and look at what do we mean by the concepts of semantics and see if we can get some agreement. And we do, I think, have agreement in our group about these things. First is definitions, a data dictionary. You've got to be able to use unambiguous terms and their meaning in the context of business as defined by the contract. That's a definition. We also have this concept of taxonomy. And taxonomy is really about how you structure and order things so they can be looked at in a meaningful way. An example of that is a share is a security and a security is a type of contract. You can also look at that as a taxonomy of species. You know, a cat is a mammal and a mammal has a backbone. Those are taxonomies. Ontologies is really what we're talking about here, is about how you look at those things that exist, the relationships about those things, and distinguish them from other things. That's what an ontology does. It's really about definitions, terms, and words in the relationship on business reality. That makes it an ontology. So a share confers voting rights is a relationship structure, ontological structure about a financial instrument. There's lots of confusion about something called syntax. And we throw that term around, but really all that says is things must be expressed logically. So you can structure the activity and look at it correctly. And you can have a syntax for spreadsheets, a syntax for diagrams, and a syntax for your XML schemas. It's really not the relevant concept when you're looking at this idea of ontology. And then what's really got everybody scared is this idea of semantic processing, which is a future technology development that says if you have defined everything semantically correct and ontologically correct, then you can take advantage of reasoning and inference engines and other things that are being used in intelligence communities to translate whether A is downgraded to B or A is something else about B. We know that they mean the same thing, and you can create those relationships, make that inference or reasoning, and there are reasoning. So semantic processing scares people. We're not really talking about that. So one of the obligations that we had in this group is to make sure that incrementally, everything we're recommending has value on its own. It can't only have value at the end of the day. It's got to have value at each step in the process. So we've got some areas of consensus. These do relate, of course, to the underlying operating assumptions. Understanding the contract is essential. Standardizing the definitions and their relationships, creating that ontology, if you will, is essential. It's got to be practical, and it means operationally practical because firms have lots of legacy environments that they've got to be able to adjust. We'd like to prepare for what we think is coming in terms of semantic processing by setting up the appropriate ontologies correctly if we can justify doing that. So that's a goal that I would think would be appropriate, but we have to look at that, whether it's going to be reasonable. And we're not there yet from the semantic processing technology perspective, although rapid advances are being made. When you look at what's going on in defense industry and intelligence, biotechnology, other areas where there are lots of scenarios and lots of factors, they all embrace semantic processing technology. It's very mature in some other areas, not so mature for the financial industry. We are really doing three things, if you will. The first one is we're going to take a careful look at FPML to make sure that its structure as a schema and a data dictionary messaging infrastructure can meet what we understand are the use cases for the regulators in terms of analysis. So a real careful gap analysis of the existing schema out there. If no gaps exist, if FPML can be used for all the things that we expect, then we would be happy and we could stop right there. If that's not the case, and the question in our mind is, can you use the FPML schema for classification, for aggregation, for analysis based on ad hoc queries? If it's not there, then we're going to look at the standard that is emerging within the industry. It is the financial industry business ontology, developed by the industry, now becoming a standard under OMG, a technical standard under OMG, to say, well, if FPML doesn't meet all requirements, can we redefine the payload, semantically, define it according to its ontology, and then use the FPML infrastructure to send it around? And that would be the second question. The open idea there is, how difficult would it be to integrate this ontology into the environments of firms? Lots of master files, they all got to be mapped and they got to be aligned, and that's not insignificant. So we got to look at, if we are going to recommend that we adopt an ontology, does that meet that practical test of implementation reality? And then the way we're going to do that, I think we actually have three recommendations at the end. One is by the winter meeting, and I wasn't precisely sure, it was just probably me. I couldn't tell whether it was, has not been set yet. Good. Okay, good. So the first winter meeting, we think we can get that gap analysis done as long as it's reasonable, not like October 2nd. But the first winter meeting, we'd like to have that gap analysis done, say, is FPML going to meet use case requirements, and are we going to have agreement on our use cases? The second objective is, all right, let's then take a look at the financial industry business ontology and figure out what is the business framework. We're not going to give you a business case, but the business framework for adopting that. How much bigger than a breadbox is it in order to integrate this ontology into real environments? And then after that, depending upon what comes out of it, we would look at let's do an assessment, a business assessment of then integrating whatever comes out, whether it's it's FPML alone, fine. If it's FPML with a payload defined by the financial industry business ontology, fine. That would be our recommendation. Hopefully by second or third winter meeting. Scott, to some degree, we'd like to align that with your regulatory deadlines. We're a little unclear about that, but that's our basic plan. So I'll take questions if you got any.
I have a question. I'm still grasping where you're going completely, to be honest. But if you kind of assume that FPML is going to be in place for trade representation, LEI is going to be in place for client and classification, right? UPIs are going to be in place for products. It doesn't appear to me there's just such a big problem here. I just might be missing it. I mean, if you're trying to run an analytical portfolio analysis, right, you have all the inputs. And sometimes what happens is you take standardization too far. So, for example, if the CFTC needs to do an analysis through the DTCC's data store that has standardization in it, I'm not sure standardization actually helps you here. Because what you want to do is you want to be able to change on the fly. You want to be able to produce the results you need based off a set of standardized data. And all the effort and what could appear to be idealism may not be worth the effort. So I kind of wonder, let's put our efforts into making sure that between ISDA and FPML, you have the right definition, trade definitions, that the UPI, in fact, sets up the product set the way you want, that, in fact, the LEI and the client classification and whatever other customization we were talking about at the break you have, then I think you can run your analytics. Like at Barclays or Goldman or anyway, we run analytics portfolio analysis all the time, and I'm not sure I'd go that far, just as a challenge.
Well, and if that's the case of the analysis, that the existing FPML classification schemes and product identification and structures are sufficient, and that'll be the recommendation that comes out of this working committee. And I can give you a personal opinion, but that's that's
See, I would think that if there is a gap, it's not that it can't happen in FPML, it's just that we have to work on putting it into FPML. The other thing I would point out is, given that most of us over the last 5 years have been in the process of adopting FPML within our firms, it would be a major, major shift of giant size to shift to another standard, given that most of us in the rates world or the credit world, FPML has been the basis of the DTC warehouse, of market wire and confirmations, it's pretty much the basis of what we do post-trade.
I don't think at the end of the day there would be any change to the use of FPML as the messaging infrastructure for the derivatives industry ever. That infrastructure exists. All we're really talking about is, can you apply semantic precision to the content within that message? And that's why around the industry, ISO is looking at applying semantic precision to 20022, because defining things according to what they are in reality does allow you to process without a lot of recoding and take advantage of analytics based on ad hoc queries.
So then, do you have any thoughts on how that might be applied, given the context of FPML being the standard
Messaging infrastructure?
Right.
It would be a alignment of a security and legal entity corporate action master files of the firms with the ontology of the industry, and that would feed FPML. So I don't really think it would affect FPML. It would affect the underlying security master files of the financial institutions, because they would have to define things correctly and structure them in their files appropriately.
Mike, are there any content and data aspects to FPML, or is it just messaging?
I think FPML has a very comprehensive data dictionary, and I think FPML's data structures are based in the contract because they're trade confirmation messages. So, and in fact, the ontology of derivatives was derived, oddly enough, from FPML. I think FPML is fine, is a good standard, and is a good activity. It's just not a semantic one.
Right, I'm just helping everyone around the table interpret what Neil is saying, which is, okay, so FPML, yes, has a messaging structure, but it also has content structure, and that is constantly evolving and changing. It may or may not be that some other modeling framework may be useful in further expanding that. It may or may not be the case, but that's what we're talking about. It's not as though we're taking. It's not a de novo exercise to add content into FPML. There's quite a bit that's already in there.
Oh, absolutely. FPML is a robust, functional standard, well done. We unraveled FPML for our ontology for derivatives, and it's it's all there. A little bit hard to unravel sometimes, but it's all there.
Perhaps another way to try to sort of put it into process a little bit more. I think that there is, as far as I can tell, there is an understanding and agreement about the gap analysis. I think the gap analysis, is a good thing to do. I think some of the questions that people are asking is, if the gap is indeed identified, is there scope within FTML as opposed to another standard to deal with the gaps. Maybe that could be another sort of avenue of inquiry that you could pursue in your working group.
Yeah, yeah.
I would be curious to understand on the step number 1, in which you want to assess the gap between FPML and the analytical requirements. What will be the input that you will use to define the analytical requirements?
Well, so we are looking at what we think transparency requirements are, what we think systemic analysis requirements are, and what we think straight-through processing requirements are. And we're looking at various use cases according to trade reporting, classification, basic analytical objectives, and trying to paint those use cases. So, I would kind of refer to that.
So it will be your own input, or you will meet with regulators to define what is the type of queries that they want to do? Because it seems to me the second one would be more effective.
Oh no, we are talking with the regulators continually. The regulators are also trying to figure out what some of these analyses will look like, and we're listening to the global conversation, see if we can capture that.
It might be more appropriate to say that the regulators are looking at what is prudent to say about those analyses.
See,
Which is one of the challenges we have. We did ask a few of the regulators if they would comment on our use case assessment. They're not always at liberty to do so because they don't want to signal to the industry, market, what they're thinking about.
I think one of the things you need to maybe think about a little bit in your group is around trade capture and STP. The industry is far into making those changes. We can't do real-time reporting in 15 minutes less or technologically as fast as possible if you haven't already started a year ago. And so most of that's going to be done by the time you come out with the semantic proposal. I guess what you don't want to do is come up with a proposal after the industry has spent hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, on adjusting their trade processing systems and their STP, electronic confirmations, and feeding down to DTCC through SDRs, and then have a new semantic way of doing things. So
I think that goes right to the operational wisdom of a recommendation, because you also have to balance: are you going to get anything out of the extra capability based on the infrastructure that's already made, or the conversion that's what we required? But so I 100% agree with that statement.
If we have no other questions, because we could move to Group 4.
Jim's going to drive, so just give us a minute. So we're a little bit different than the other groups because you've all had to talk about data standards, and we're talking about how the data gets stored and retrieved, and we don't actually define the standards ourselves. We're dependent on all the other standards that all these different groups are defining. What we have tried to do, our objective is to produce a white paper. We have a draft of that, which we will be circulating after this to the whole subcommittee. We would like comments back, since we are highly dependent and since at the back end of all this. And we really thought there were three things we needed to talk about in the white paper. The first was we wanted to talk about a common language for describing the functionality that would exist within an SDR. And so that people could talk about, okay, how am I going to get the data in? How am I going to get the data out? What are the different roles of participants? And we wanted, for some of the functionality, an abstract description, but we didn't want to be prescriptive about how people would actually build the functionality. So you have to have this functionality. There are given terms, so when we talk about who's a market participant, who's recording the data, where does it have to be recorded, there were all the sort of defined terms you'd have in a contract, but without saying, okay, you must use FPML, you must not use FPML. That's up to the in a sense, the other working groups. In some cases, it's left up to the SDRs themselves. We wanted to provide some recommendations about where standardization would help and could be applied within the SDRs. And we had to talk about a timeline. So I think, Jim? Okay. So what are our main sections? Well, the first one was about source data for cleared and uncleared swaps. They're not necessarily the same thing. Some observations on the need for standard storage methods. Some principles for enabling the public and private retrieval of data. Again, they're not quite the same thing. Some discussion of a timeline, and then our glossary, which is the common language that people will use to talk about the different participants. With source data sounds pretty simple, and most of you all have talked about FPML. FPML is great for most OTC products. It's not the standard for exchange-traded products. Many exchange-traded products are in FixML, and people report using that. And it's not clear that you want SDRs to only have one way of getting the data. The other question is around exotics. One of the earlier groups talked about using within FPML the I forget what the exact term was. The
Generic.
The generic. Thank you. The generic standard. That doesn't give you the economics of a transaction. So while you will need the generic part of FPML to report some exotics, you'll still need to send, in some sense, the full confirm, or you won't have the trade details. And the SDR is required to take the full trade details. And that's, at least at the beginning, an interim step. One could conceive of going further and using something like Perl, which the SEC talked about in Regulation AB, but that's in some sense up to the SDR, and it's up to the SDR in terms of how they're going to meet the later requirements that are imposed by the CFTC. Right now, those requirements haven't been set, so it's not clear what the SDR is going to need to do. And you'll see that reflected in a couple of our points. Okay, so source data. So again, we talked about one of the really complicated problems. How do we combine OTC and cleared worlds to support movement of products? If you have a standardized transaction that is cleared, that's traded on an exchange, you don't necessarily need the full FPML, you don't have it. How should the industry think about coming to a common single data standard? Do we need a single data standard, or are we willing to accept two, depending on where it's coming from, and have the SDR translate? Okay, so storage. Storage is an interesting problem. Data has to get stored for a long time. Swaps exist for a lot longer than futures contracts. And with a 5-year proposed retention rule, a 50-year swap would have to be maintained for 55 years. 55 years is certainly longer than any of us have been in the business. It's longer than a significant number of the people in this room have been alive. And the technology is going to change a lot. Because these are legal documents and legal records, there are some implications, and we discussed them more fully in the white paper, about what gets stored. Do you always have to store the original record that was sent to you? Swaps didn't exist 50 years ago. FPML didn't exist 50 years ago. It's not clear that these formats will be the same. And so the question, there's going to be some legal questions around this as to whether the original record has to be preserved or whether you have to preserve the economics, but if the formats change over time in 20 or 30 years, what do you do? We felt that the data standards, data storage methods should not be mandated to a particular technology. So while right now there's going to have to be standards that are set for what people send in, there are different people who are going to sign up to be SDRs right now that are already using different technologies to store their data internally. Any SDR that's, for example, accepting interest rate derivatives, they might be using a vendor system, they might be using a bespoke system that they designed. They've got all their own internal data structures. They should be allowed to keep those. I think this gets to the Commissioner Amalia's cost-benefit question. There's no reason to make them change that, but they have to have standardized way of the data, getting the data in, and they have to have standardized output. So when the regulators come along and say, we want an answer, there have to be standardized ways of saying, here's my question, you give me the answer in the standard format. I don't care how you stored it internally, as long as it works, but I better be able to get it out in a standardized way. Retrieval. So there's two different kinds of retrieval. There's public information. And the public information is going to be standardized. It's not going to have a lot of information beyond the UPI, a price, a a little bit of information probably around the credit terms, just because if you trade something that's collateralized or not collateralized, it may not have what the terms are, but otherwise you could have a swap that's collateralized and a swap that's uncollateralized, and you'd have, frankly, they could be trading 50 basis points apart on the coupon, and you wouldn't know. So you need to know if it's a standard trade or if there's some credit in it. You don't need to know, and the public will not necessarily know who the counterparties are or what the credit charge was, but they should know there's something different. Regulators and market participants need full access to the data, and they're going to need some sort of standard API from the SDR. The regulators need it because they want to do analysis. The market participants need it because each market participant, when they report data to an SDR, is going to need to see all of their own trades that are living at that SDR in case there's a mistake, in case there's a cancel and correct. And so there's going to be a couple of different levels of security. The regulators will be able to see everything. The public will get the data that gets reported out, and there's going to have to be some security around the fact that our friends from Barclays can see their trades and our friends from Goldman Sachs can see their trades, but they can't each see each other's trades. And only one of those people is the reporting counterparty. We have put in an appendix, a somewhat generic version of what the API should look like. It's not a real API. It's a sketch of the functionality. It says you should have a function that does X and a function that does Y. We actually believe that that API is going to change a lot over time. In the rule, there's some heavy-duty analysis that gets contemplated. It's only implied in one or two sentences, but the regulators can ask the SDRs to do analysis for them. Eventually, the SDRs may be required to have the ability to run complex models. That's not going to be something that happens on day one. We've all already discussed that, but it's allowed by the regulation. And if that happens, the API will need to evolve to support that. And then, of course, there's a timeline question. There's not a start date that's yet set for reporting, but there's different types of functionalities, and they're all going to need different test periods and start dates. And as somebody else previously mentioned around the reporting, there's going to be a beta test period for each one. And there are, as we've thought about it, there were 5 separate milestones that needed to be talked about. One was the actual trade reporting to the regulators and the SDRs. Got to start on some date. Then there's trade data dissemination. So just because the data is going in to the regulator or to the SDR doesn't mean it's coming out in a real-time feed. So those could be separate dates. We think those two are probably the same date, but they might not be. The second question is, when are the regulators going to be able to query the trade data? This is the data that gets reported. So data is going to come in, has to come out in some way for people to do analysis. But it's not, it's simple queries. It went in, can I get the same stuff out? The second thing is risk information. So at this point, can I actually find out, for example, if you've reported a derivative and you've reported the value of that derivative every day, at what point are the regulators going to be able to ask, well, what's the delta equivalent of that? That's a minimum that's necessary if you want to set things like position reporting limits. And the last thing is what I'll call flexible reporting, when you want to be able to come in, and the last one, the flexible reporting, is probably several years out, where the regulators want to come in and say, I want to do a complex analysis on this thing, this portfolio that you've got. I want to see the interconnections among these firms. I want to run it using a stress test. And you tell me back, what are the exposures of these people under the stress test? In the rule, you could read a section of the rule, and we cite it in the white paper, to say that the regulators should be able to ask that question. It's not clear if they will, but it's pretty clear nobody's going to be able to do that on day one. So we're very interested in saying, well, when's a reasonable date that somebody who chooses to become an SDR should have to be able to do this by? And so we want to give some guidance, because really what we're talking about is someone's going to choose to be an SDR. They know they have to accept data. They know they have to store it. But there's some other things they're going to have to do eventually, and they need to know what the requirements are going to be, when they're going to have to get there. And a lot of it, as we said, is dependent upon when these other data standards are available. You can't do counterparty analysis within an SDR if you don't have the confirms. So it's clear that that's not going to happen until after the master agreement semantics are agreed. So I think that's mostly what we wanted to present. As I said, we've got a white paper. It's much more dense. It's got the full glossary. And we really would like comments from the other groups because we're very heavily dependent upon what they've said. So we will be circulating that to you by email hopefully next week. I don't know if there's any questions.
Adam, is that white paper going to be posted on the CFTC website, or how does that work?
Well, the intention initially is for us to circulate it with the group. If it has to be posted on the website, and I think that's for the lawyers at the CFTC to tell us, then it will. But it's definitely something for comment. You'll see things in there like, for example, on the dates, it says things like MMDD, YYYY, because we don't know yet. Again, these are not rules. You know, in an ideal world, we would circulate it among the group. Eventually, we expect it to be posted when it's in final form, but I don't know the regulations.
Hi, this is Nancy Doyle from the Office of General Counsel. This is a public and transparent process, so anyone member of the public who wants to see the draft, I'll give them a copy of it. But in terms of not, having multiple drafts going out, except for when wants request, we're going to wait and for administrative convenience, post the final one on the website. So you can do internal comments. Just be mindful that people can listen on this discussion to whatever extent they want to. Okay?
Okay. No, that's
if you have any
fine.
questions in practice that becomes difficult, contact me, but that should work.
Again, we've tried to be fairly
People have been very good about letting me know what's going on and when their meetings are, so if anyone wants to listen in, they can. We've not had a problem so far. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions?
I think you posed a critical question about how to mingle together OTC, what's currently OTC derivatives, and exchange traded derivatives in terms of a format. And you said that, do you think there might be more elaboration on the answer beyond just sort of broader principles?
I think you're asking me, but I think Jim has. I will attempt to answer after Jim, but he's actually much more knowledgeable about the exchange traded side, I think, than I am.
I would say, we're working towards that, trying to figure out, what's the best way forward. I think, Commissioner O'Malley made reference to the large trader rule, and we're kind of facing this head on in that rulemaking where there's a prescriptive rule on the table that's been approved, and as we look at the detail, it requires large trader reporting of both cleared and uncleared swaps, and we're having trouble fitting the cleared side into the buckets that are in the prescribed in the rule. So I think that's one process where we're getting actual firsthand experience working through this very issue, and there's a working group that's actually on that topic as we speak. So, there might be some insight that comes out of that process.
I think the other thing to keep in mind, just the discussion that Neil and Michael had around semantics, there's a lot of reporting and communication that already goes on in the OTC market in FPML. So the OTC guys, they don't really want to change. It's going to be very expensive. On the other hand, all of the exchanges are already using FIX for their reporting. So if we do push towards a common standard, at some point, some set of participants is going to have to go through a major conversion. And so there's definitely going to be a cost-benefit question there.
Interestingly, I may or may not feed into what you do. We had some also internal discussions about this issue, and something came up, and it probably came up in your working group too, is there seems to be technologically possible to embed FIX within FPML and vice versa. So in principle, to the extent that the messaging technology exists and it's designed for a particular protocol, it may actually pull along with it portions of another protocol. This may be something that's already been looking into, Jim.
Yes, that is one possibility, and that might just be the process that needs to be followed. Both groups kind of have to get together and basically come up with a new standard that represents, an amalgamation of two different formats or whatever. Another possibility is if the source data is actually substantially different, to maybe support both formats, at least at the start, and then, over time, as things develop, work towards, joining them.
If I can add to that, I think it goes back to one of the questions that was asked earlier, to make that distinction in FPML, for example, between what is the messaging portion and what is the data representation. And the work that we talked about that's happening on UPI, unique product identifiers, will actually make it easier to, for example, transport in FPML representation over a fixed payload. So there's certainly work happening in also working groups to see how we can represent, for example, an OTC contract through characteristics such as a UPI over a fixed protocol.
So to add to that, Andre, so that's correct. We have been using now in production FPML embedded inside FIX. So these are already being used in the industry. And FIX is very good for defining the messaging protocol, also the format. And FPML is more, we see it more like the format, the content of it, not so much like the messaging protocol. So we have been successfully using, FPML embedded inside FIX.
Perhaps if Jim finds it useful and members of the group may find it useful, you can elaborate to them about, just sort of your experiences and what you've done.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually, because on the electronic trading side, most industry is moving to fixed gateways anyway. So within the industry, you have both fix and FPML established, right? To me, the key points are it's actually a positive that the OTC side of the equation is standarding on FPML, and you already have a standard on the exchange side. And the real importance here is when you exchange information, you have a standard way of doing it. But actually, when you take that information and load it in the SDR, I'm certainly not going to turn to Bob and say, pick a standard of that the industry should define is the best way to store the data and produce the results that the CFTC wants. He should take the data in and find the most optimized way to produce the analytics, to store the data for 50 to 100 years. And I don't think that's standard. I think that's the best way to produce the results that the CFTC needs. The more important part is that we have standard ways of exchanging data. We have standard ways of identifying products or clients. So I don't know. I think your presentation is great. It lays out the challenges. But I think we're kind of heading in the right direction. And if we bring FixML and FPML together, I don't think we're in a bad place.
I'd say on my own personal side, I'm more concerned about how the retrieval gets designed than I think you're right. With Fix and FPML, one way or the other, we'll get that sorted out.
Internally in Barclays, if I had both, I wouldn't be fixated on the standard. I'd be fixated on how do I get the best performance, how do I get the best ability to archive and retrieve the data, and how do I produce the results that my consumer needs. And if standards help, great. If they don't, then you use a proprietary standard internally. Because you also got to be worried about how heavy these messages are, and how do you optimize for efficiency.
When you say how heavy these are, can you elaborate on that?
It's one of the things that FPML does is it provides a very descriptive language of the data you want to store, and that's good. That's good when you're trying to have self-describing data on a post-trade basis. But if you were building algos or electronic trading, it's way too heavy of a language. You need a much more smaller message payload and drive efficiency. And if you're Bob in the DTCC, once you load up all this data and you have all kinds of analytical retrievals and things, you may not pick FPML as your way of storing. In fact, you probably won't, right? You're going to pick the most optimized way to provide the results you need to the user base that needs it.
I think though that one of the things we should consider here too is that mixing OTC and exchange traded data. There's a lot of future states where we can get to, but there's, I'm, as a working hard to build an SDR, I have to say that we're staying pretty focused on the requirements of the day. So while a lot of what we've been talking about here is future states, but some of the things that we have, at least that we're focusing on are very practical oriented. And FPML is the by far predominant way of describing trade data today, so we're focusing in on FPML. I think that should we need to have exchange traded intermingling, then we'll focus on that. But that's not, at least from our read, a current requirement in the United States. So that's one point of it. And one of the other things that I just comment on from the presentation, which was really very good, thank you, was that there is an expectation that upon implementation of the rules, that the reporting of the data, and however it's stored, but the reporting of the data when it comes in FPML, it's incumbent on an SDR, at least we believe it as one of the SDRs, that it's incumbent on us to be able to provide data to the regulators based on what was submitted in. That doesn't mean, and I think that needs to be some really thought about how soon that public reporting of the data follows thereafter. Those don't have to be at the same time. And I think that one of the things I just want to bring back, we may sound like a broken record, but having a UPI nailed down is very important before I think the public reporting happens, because while all of the data can come in for reporting to the regulators, I think we have to have some building blocks in place and implemented, not just technically defined, but implemented in order to have, excuse me, in order to have all of the appropriate pieces in place before public data is shown. So I think that was a little different than what you had said, and I'd like to point out that.
Actually, maybe I said it a little differently, but in the white paper, we very explicitly say that we expect that part of the public dissemination of data will include the UPI, because otherwise it won't be meaningful.
I would probably also add that, as far as I know, it's also not specified that the way data comes in and the way data is reported are in the same protocol. But obviously from the standardization perspective, it would be better if they were in the same protocol, because it really cuts down on how much needs to be done. Storage is different. Storage, you will evolve and see what's the best schema, what's the best architecture for storing.
One thing about storage, what you just mentioned, somebody mentioned in one of the earlier presentations about whether you should report lifecycle data or point-in-time data, because it was enough for risk. One of the interesting questions around storage is you're probably going to want to store lifecycle data even if you don't report point-in-time data, or you're going to end up with an overwhelming data problem. So the storage may end up driving what people ask to have reported in, or they'll have to do a lot of technical work to translate it back.
You're going to say something about?
Yeah, I was just, while very few trades are of 50-year duration, most are 5 to 10, many, well, and FX obviously much shorter, but quite a few are 5 to 10. Certainly by 50 years from now, storage technology will be different, but I'd say that 5 years from now, storage technology will be different. So I think the cost-benefit analysis of how you store the data from a repository perspective is going to be driven by the data retrieval needs and the data submission needs, and that's going to happen, and that's likely to evolve. So I think that one of the points that was said is that that can evolve, and it shouldn't be mandated, I think is essential, because otherwise you'd get forced into suboptimal solutions as technology changes.
Jim or Adam, do you have anything else? Well, thank you very much to all of you for these presentations. It's been great. We are contemplating the following. Since you have such great lines of communication and regular meetings already, we've put on the schedule that we have an hour devoted to individual groups meetings, but this being Friday afternoon, what we're thinking of doing is maybe having some closing remarks right now. And those of you from the working groups who would like to continue in face-to-face meetings are welcome to stay and do so. Afterwards, the microphones are going to be open, the public would still be listening, the cameras would still be on, so it will continue to be a public meeting. But for those of you who have your own regular meeting schedules and already, well beyond just sort of just sort of the initial introductions, you can just have a brief meeting, decide on the next deliverables, and move on.
Well, I want to thank everybody who came today and for the extraordinary amount of work that has gone into this. This has exceeded my expectations, so I greatly appreciate that. I'm amazed that we have some timelines. We're going to have some working white papers. We have some gap analysis that's going to be done, and some real business analysis, some cost-benefit analysis, and some next steps in defining some of these things. So I think all the working groups have done a tremendous job to really advance the ball here. I'm kind of taking notes here and reflecting about the interaction with our various rules and the importance how our teams need to think about this going forward. So I'll be following up with the various teams to make sure that they're aware of your efforts and where you're going. I think our next meeting is targeted for November 4th, public meeting here. And I'm giving some consideration right now to a full Technology Advisory Committee in mid-December, in which I would like to have the various working groups be on that agenda as well. But that has to work in amongst our other various rulemakings that are ongoing right now. So we'll try to squeeze all of this into the very busy schedule that the Commission has. And I think we have the chairman walking in right now. We're just making some closing remarks and some observations of today's papers, which I forwarded to you, but I think we've done a tremendous amount of work to get some great data, some good discussion here today about what's possible and where we're going from here on the next steps. Working papers are being developed. We have some timelines on LEI and UPI, gap analysis, and other things are going to be done in the various working groups. So, I'd also point out that they've already put together 40 meetings amongst the various groups to add to the working effort here. So they've really achieved quite a bit, and we're going to cut them loose a little earlier, and then we're going to make them stay for another working group session. So if you have any observations or issues you'd like to raise, please do.
No, I am not as close to this as either Commissioner Amaya and Andre and you all are, but and I apologize I couldn't sit here all day, but I had a chance to sit through other things. But that's the division of labor that we have at the Commission and the staff. But I think that what you're doing and helping us on the technical side of so many of these issues, whether it's LEI and the other pieces, are going to be enormously helpful to the market ultimately. Obviously, it also helps us as we sort through this. The data collection issues, if we can get it right, I think is going to make us a lot better at surveillance on the market and everything that we do. You know, we're in active rule writing as well, but beyond the rule writing, it's the implementation side that I think this is going to be a tremendous help. And John Rogers, of course, and everything that he's doing in standing up a new Office of Data and Technology. I mean, it's not that we didn't have data and technology, but bringing it together. So I thank you for all that you're doing. You can just help us get some resources so that we can have some money to actually spend on technology. That would be helpful too, but that's not your job. But I always have to get that pitch in. You know, we spend in a year on technology what some firms spend in a day. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for coming, and we'll make sure you have all this data as well. So to the working groups, unless there are any final from either the SEC or FERC, if you want to make any comments.
No, just echoing your comments. Really impressed with the amount of work and the quality of interaction and the quality of work. It's really terrific.
Thank you for your participation as well, Walter.
And I just want to echo Walter. This has been a really good learning experience for me, and I appreciate you inviting FERC along for the ride.
With that, thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice weekend.